because we had some people who really want to attend, but were unable to make it at this time. And so if you have any questions or issues with it, you can send me a quick email at buffalocommons@cornell.edu. I'll also type it in the chat, or you can chat me. My host name is Buffalo Commons to make it easy on everyone. But I'm going to take a few quick minutes to share a little bit about our work before we dive into the good stuff. I promise not to take too long, but we're just giving folks a few more minutes to join us as well. So I work on Buffalo Commons, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a joint collaboration between Cornell, ILR, Buffalo CoLab in partnership with the public good. PPG, for those of you who may not know, is a local, as in Western New York, community-based think tank with over 300 organizational partners. And I'll type the link to that in the chat as well. So we really envision our work as a true commons, for those of you who are familiar with it, or a shared space where individuals, organizations, and anyone really can collaborate to share ideas for the betterment of our community. So there's a few different things that we regularly work on and that you all might be interested as participants in this workshop. So the first is maintaining a digital library of really relevant information. We have over 500 resources, from research to fact sheets to publicly available photos. So if your organization is looking to do some marketing, you're welcome to use or download those. If you're looking to implement things in your classroom, we really highly encourage that. But the thing that links them all is it's really specifically about this place, so Buffalo, Niagara region, or Western New York. It's available on PPG's site and Cornell's digital library. And Erin actually has several resources on this site as well, so I'll put the link to that in the chat too. But if you or your organization has resources, or you're a researcher that you want information amplified or shared with a wider audience, we are, I would say 9 times out of 10, always able to put it on the site and try to encourage others to learn from you and your work so no one has to recreate any wheels. Second thing we work on is a researchers network. So there's over 175 different researchers from over 21 institutions of higher ed that we have here locally in Cornell. So these are folks who have said that they're interested in doing Western New York focused research or who have done it in the past. So we have this research exchange where organizations can fill out a small form. Or if you don't like forms, you can just reach out to us, where we try to pair your research questions with one of the researchers in the network to try to add that capacity that you or your organization may not have. Or if you do research, again, you don't have to be affiliated with a university or college, and you want to be in the researchers network, just let us know. We'll put you up there and we can link you to some of these questions that our partners are asking. And the third thing we work on are workshops, which is right here, right now. We typically offer them in person. We love when people can talk to each other and collaborate. So if you want to secretly chat people today, that's totally fine. But we usually offer in-person technical assistance, informational or capacity building workshops. We always try to make them free and open to the public, again, to this idea of a public commons. You see that we've transitioned virtually, and we have some really exciting ones that we're going to offer in the upcoming weeks. So I'll put a link to the chat as well. And just a reminder, at the end of this workshop, we'll be sending out a feedback survey. It helps us to keep these free and available to everyone. It also helps us to know what other topics would be really useful for our community partners, for community members. So we highly encourage you to fill that out, and hopefully it'll be in your inbox on Thursday. So really quick, just a few housekeeping things. Those of you who may be familiar with Zoom, I see some of you are brave souls during this lunchtime hour, putting on your cameras. If you're not comfortable, you don't have to do that. If you are, you're encouraged to. We love to see your smiling faces. But you do have the option to mute your audio or not use your video. There'll be some opportunities when Erin's going to pose some questions, so you can unmute yourself, or you can ask a question out loud, or you can type it in the chat. So whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Just to make sure the chat is working and also to shake out some limbs, it would be great if you could type in your name, your organization, if you're affiliated with one, and the reason you decided to join us today. So it could be something you hope to learn, could be a big question you're trying to answer, tackle, or just because you really like Erin and you want to see his face. So just highly encourage you to utilize the chat right now just to make sure it works. If you are having connectivity issues, which I know I sometimes do, I've been relegated to the basement. You can reduce your bandwidth by temporarily turning off your video, or you can exit out of any other programs or applications you might be using. For me, it's always Outlook that takes up a lot of the bandwidth. I'll be regularly monitoring the chat. I know Aaron said he will also, so you can ask questions at any time. We'll try to elevate them, answer them as best we can. We'll share any links or resources in the recording in the follow-up email. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to get us started. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even though it's digitally instead of over lunch. I know we all like lunch, myself included. But yeah, many thanks to the Buffalo CoLab and PPG for hosting today's session. Now, as Kristen mentioned, I'm an independent researcher and consultant based here in Buffalo, New York. And my work focuses on bridging the gaps between research, policy, and practice. And throughout my career, I find that visual options are hands down the easiest way to communicate complex ideas, concepts, and policies. And my work over the past 15 years has brought opportunities to do work around the world and across the country, connecting with networks and individuals and organizations trying to build more open and inclusive societies. And my particular skill set includes quantitative, qualitative, and geospatial techniques, and I specialize in data collection, analysis, and reporting across each of those domains of information. I'm looking forward to sharing a bit of that work with you today, but I wanted to start off by acknowledging the title of the session, The Power of a Picture. That concept, the power of a picture, sums up my perspective on data visualization when it comes to advocacy and impact. And when I first started putting my thoughts together for this session, I initially believed that I would have to spend time convincing you of the concept of visual dominance, that our sense of sight and the information it provides to our brain is in fact prioritized by our brain over all of the other senses. We react to things we see quicker than anything else, but I don't actually have to convince anyone of that at this stage. I think COVID-19 already did. What do I mean by that? Well, we all experience the world through our eyes. And there are many lessons from the past few months, but one of the greatest and longest lasting lessons will be the power of pictures. And when it comes to data visualization and dashboards, I have no doubt that nearly everyone in this session has seen this dashboard. It's the Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 dashboard. Indeed, I'll say that our collective understanding of COVID-19 has been set against the backdrop of this particular dashboard. And I have no doubt, excuse me, that every day, because of its billions and billions of views, that the world continued to turn to this particular set of data visualizations to understand what was going on. And then, once we had a handle on where the coronavirus was located and where it was heading, we once again turned to data visualization to solve a very challenging issue. What do we do about it? Flatten the curve. This has been our rallying cry over the last few months, and this particular data visualization is now imprinted in the minds of billions of people around the world. And it has become, without a doubt, one of, if not the most, powerful pictures in the history of humanity. In mere months, this image was used to effectively slow down the spread of coronavirus and begin changing everything about the world as we know it. It was used to convince people from every background you can imagine around the world that we could do something about the virus. And then, after we had a handle on what we needed to do, we turned to data visualization yet again to track our progress, the impact of our behaviors on that actual curve. Now, I spoke with many people across the country and around the world over the past few months who shared that they had watched at least one of Governor Andrew Cuomo's briefings, coronavirus briefings, and they noted in particular how effective and informative those briefings were. They didn't always mention data visualization, but I think if you've seen these briefings, you understand the power of data visualization in tracking our response to COVID-19. And day by day, it's become clear that data visualizations might now be the hottest commodity when it comes to communicating, educating, advocating, and persuading. And then data visualization started showing us other perspectives on the COVID-19 response. This one's from King County in Washington State, which was among the first to report on the disparities that they were seeing between white patients and patients of color. COVID-19 was and is affecting communities of color in alarmingly disproportionate ways, and data visualization helped us understand that very, very quickly. And then we saw other visualizations. This one comes from the Pew Research Center, showing us that it isn't just the patients who are victims of coronavirus, but it's also entire communities that are affected. We have to remember how hard it is to lose someone, and then think about what it would be like if everyone you knew suddenly lost somebody all at the same time. Data visualizations help us understand that entire communities are being harmed by this disease, even if they aren't lying in an ICU bed. Data visualizations have also clearly shown the economic damage wrought by COVID-19. Unemployment rates before, during, and after the Great Recession were already pronounced and divided. Now, in our current time, people of color are unemployed at rates much higher than white Americans. Let's see. And so it should be no surprise then that data visualization came to the rescue once again when we started to comprehend just how significant the murder of George Floyd would be. Here's a map of the protests, the vigils, and events protesting Floyd's death, and the distinct lack of public accountability in some of our local police departments. I hope what I shared didn't get anyone too riled up. I know a lot of people understand what I just shared, but I know that a lot of people don't understand what I just shared. But data visualizations do help us understand what it is I just shared. And that was the point. There is incredible power in pictures, and data visualizations are now front and center in our lives. So today's agenda is straightforward. I'll start with a short overview of how images have been used to highlight problematic social conditions, and we'll share an overview of charts, a basic overview of charts and data visualizations. Then we'll get into the good stuff. I have some best practices to share when it comes to creating data visualizations for advocacy and impact reporting. And we'll go through a useful data visualization checklist. And I'll end by sharing some of my favorite software, data, and learning resources. So let's get into it. Now, my last name is, in fact, Krolikowski, and I come from proud Polish stock. So it's no surprise that as I was growing up, I learned to admire the great Polish thinkers, perhaps one of the greatest being Nicholas Copernicus. Now, his work changed the world, and he is best known as a leader in the scientific revolution due to this particular image within this particular book. This image proposes a heliocentric view of the solar system that places the sun at the center, because old thinking at the time, or current thinking at the time of the publication of this book, we did believe, and it was accepted, that the Earth was the center of the universe. So this was a big change, and this image was a bit provocative, let's say. And Copernicus knew how dangerous this image could be for himself and for his family and for people he knew. And he actually finished the book in the 1530s, but he waited until he was near death to publish it. And rightly so. It was on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books for over 200 years, until about 1758, when they took it off and said that Catholics could start reading about our sun-centered solar system again. So around that same time that the church was just starting to lighten up on Copernicus, another image was on its way to stoke controversy and revolution. And this image, which many of us recognize, is attributed to Benjamin Franklin in 1754, more than 20 years before the American Revolution broke out. But it was particularly effective at advocating for a unified and independent nation, separate from colonial masters. Franklin would go on to be one of the most beloved founding fathers, and the United States, well, became the United States. And we continued using images to shape who we became as a country. So nearly 100 years after the country was founded, another image was used to advocate for a new future. This is a classic. It's called American Progress by John Gast, and it epitomizes the idea of American expansionism, reinforcing the idea of manifest destiny. Kind of a third grade or fifth grade callback there, but manifest destiny was the idea that the US should and ought to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But this image, if you look closely, you can see that it simultaneously illustrates what was seen as the positive sides of American expansionism, but also the damaging actions inflicted on Native people and the environment by settlers and industry. Now, a little bit later on, a few decades, I'll say, after American Progress was put out and we sort of built our industry and pushed out and spread across the entire country, another, excuse me, a new period emerged in American history from roughly 1890 to 1920. And when I was in middle school, I first learned about the American Progressive Era, which these photos are from, these images. And during this era, people were working to bring attention to the social ills brought on by things like industrialization, urbanization, migration, and political corruption. And the person whose ideas stuck with me the most at that time were Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine was a man who believed that he could use photography as a tool for social reform. And that's exactly what he did. Hine's photography was instrumental in bringing awareness, building awareness and bringing an end to many child labor practices in the United States. And it's not a stretch in any way to say that child labor laws were changed in response to his photographs. Without a doubt, Hine's work is one of the best examples of the importance of using visual communication to accelerate social change in the ways that we think of it today. So fast forwarding another 100 years, we come to another set of images that I'd like to share. And here are some satellite images that are very, very interesting to me. But I'd like you to figure out what is so interesting about them. So I'm going to show you a series of 4 photographs, or 4 sets of photos, making a comparison. And they are making the same comparison. We won't know everything, but I'm hoping that you can use the chat box to share a guess of what it is you're looking at. And you can enter your guesses in the chat box as I go through the 4 sets of images. But remember, each photo is showing the same thing, and you can use the chat box to share your guess with the group. So this first set of images comes from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Photo number 1 shows the neighborhood of Rosina, and photo number 2 shows the aerial image of Zona Sul. The second set of images comes from Beijing, China. Photo number 1 shows the neighborhood of Fengte, and photo number 2 shows the neighborhood of Chaoyang. And again, I'm showing a relationship here. We're making a comparison using satellite images. What do you think we're looking at? The third set of photos are from Chicago, a little bit closer to where we are today. Photo number 1 shows the neighborhood of Woodlawn, and photo number 2 shows Hyde Park. Again, we're looking at the same kind of relationship. Any guesses yet? Okay, we're seeing a few coming in. I'm going to show one more set of photos. And finally, we come to a favorite city of mine. It's Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where I was a resident during my PhD research and field work and other work during my life. But the first part shows Makangira in Mikoroshini, and part 2 shows a neighborhood just next to it called Oyster Bay. And yes, that dividing line in the photo is a single street. Those from Buffalo might understand the significance of the dividing line of a single street. But yes, that is the same photo, and you've got 2 different worlds on opposite sides of the street. And the other photo shows a neighborhood called Hana Nasif, and across the river there is a neighborhood called Upanga. I used to live in Upanga while I was a resident in Tanzania. So what are we looking at? I'm going to take a look at the chat box. I see we have a few answers coming in. So let's see, organic development versus planned development. We saw some of that for sure. Tree coverage, poverty, tree canopy, income disparity, greenery in urban areas. Great, so redlining as well. I think all of these are very, very relevant. But when you look at the data that's kind of on the ground, I think Seth got it the closest when he said wealth related to tree density. We know that there are very, very clear correlations between urban tree cover and the wealth within a specific neighborhood for a variety of different reasons. Let me just make sure I pull that chat box back up. But yes, so that one, definitely, urban income inequality as demonstrated by urban tree cover. So many thanks for participating there. I have another one for you. Here's another image. I'm not going to tell you where it's from. Some of you might be able to recognize it, but in the broadest of terms, what is it that you are looking at? What do you see here? Okay, first answer, definitely hit it right on the head. From Jim, this is in fact the Tonawanda Coke site in Tonawanda, New York. And we are looking at, I'd say more broadly, we're looking at an image of urban pollution. I think we can all agree that particular site is far more polluted just on a visual, looking visually, it's far more polluted than the surrounding areas. So one more, would love your answers on this one, or your guesses on this one. It's a little bit tougher, but what are you looking at? What is this image showing us? Any guesses? Guesses would go in the chat box. And it can be broad strokes. You don't have to actually know what we're looking at. Okay, I see a guess of unemployment, a hockey stick. Any other thoughts? Illness, current trends in coronavirus cases, a threshold. Thank you very much, Alvin. Yes, we're looking at a threshold. Climate change, unemployment rate. I'm gonna take the next step and we see population density here as well. Some really good guesses, but I'm gonna say that you're looking at the same exact thing that was in the previous picture, but just represented in a different way. Right? The aerial view from above and the data visualization that are created here, they're showing here, showing the same thing. Pollution from the former Tonawanda Coke Corporation. And this is a recreation of a data visualization I created in early 2009 when I was working as a policy intern with the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York. There had been a 5-year grassroots movement to raise awareness about the pollution coming from Tonawanda Coke, but the facility was technically exempt from air pollution regulations. Don't ask me how the regulations were written. I'll leave that to the policy researchers in the room, but they were exempt for whatever reason, unless they were given the strictest permit. And there was a re-permitting process coming up that year in 2009. So we wanted to make sure that they had the strictest permit, or that we were ready for that fight. And so the visualization here shows that Tonawanda Coke was emitting benzene, a known carcinogen, above the level that even the strictest permit allowed. And these are self-reported figures. So this is what was on the reports that they sent to the EPA and to the DEC. Just thinking about it right now makes me a little bit dizzy because it was an extremely complicated regulatory situation. But the data visualization helped to make clear the most important point, that Tonawanda Coke was going to be regulated whether they liked it or not. They were emitting above a standard threshold. And that's all we were really showing with that data visualization. But it was powerful. Later that year, a DEC study found that the emissions reports were in fact falsified and that Tonawanda Coke was releasing obscene and illegal levels of benzene into the atmosphere. And a few months after that, the facility was raided by the US Department of Justice. People went to prison for violating the Clean Air Act, and Tonawanda Coke was ordered to pay over $24 million in fines. So data visualizations like the one from the Clean Air Coalition and those I shared at the beginning of the session, these are what we call, some of us call, boundary objects. And boundary objects are things that have an ability to be mutually recognizable among different groups while adapting to the specific needs of each of them. You saw urban pollution when you looked at the aerial view of Tonawanda Coke. The community experienced that same pollution, but the reality of that carcinogenic pollution was technically hidden from the system of regulation and law enforcement that was supposed to control it. Community, regulators, law enforcement, even though they might all speak English, it does not mean they speak the same language. And a boundary object, like a data visualization, can break across institutional, demographic, and educational boundaries in society. From people who see themselves as experts all the way at the top of society to regular community members moving, like some of us, moving about our day-to-day business down on the ground. But I agree with the perspective shared by Dr. Will Allen here, a researcher at the University of Oxford, who argues that data visualization is a process of visual brokerage. And so to get you in the mindset of being a data visualizer in the fields of advocacy and impact, if you're creating data visualizations for these purposes, it is very helpful to think of yourself as that visual broker, translating information at the boundaries between groups that are not able to communicate effectively with one another. One other key point to remember is that as a visual broker, you have a critical role to play in mediating the conflict between the perspectives between local knowledge and expert knowledge. In our society, and in most Western societies, expert knowledge is usually prioritized over local knowledge. Yet it is the local knowledge and context that provides the nuance you need to craft the most effective data visualizations. The most powerful visualizations are those that translate expert knowledge through the lens of local understanding. And so what actually is data visualization? I've given you a lot of information so far, but we haven't even defined what I mean by a data viz. So I use Kirk's, somebody named Professor Kirk. I use his definition of data visualization as the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. And I really like this definition in particular because it speaks to the importance of intentional design decisions. You're not just plugging and chugging in Excel. You really have to make conscious decisions about what your visualizations are looking like. They also emphasize, this definition emphasizes experience with the audience. You have to know how to present the data effectively in a way that the audience, whoever it is going to understand. And it also focuses on facilitating understanding. So that gets you to ask who needs to understand. And in order to understand who that is and how they'll understand, you need to be familiar with the local environment and context in which that data visualization is going to be delivered. Now, each of these elements are influenced by the decisions you make related to things like chart choice, color, text, lines, audience data literacy, and other factors that we'll talk about throughout the remainder of today's session. But just at this moment, I want to go take a moment to pause before we get into that, and I'm just going to revisit the chat box. Are there any questions about anything I've shared so far? Oh, great. I see that's from Buffalo Commons. Thanks, Kristen. Let's see. Give everybody just a second to pull that out if they need to. Thanks, Charlene. Okay, I'm going to continue moving on because I think this is why you're all here, the next section. So let's get into it. Okay, so when we are talking about chart choice, if you ever need help thinking about what type of chart or graph to use, one of my favorite resources is something called the Graphic Continuum. It's a data visualization of data visualizations. So it's kind of, you use this massive chart to navigate your way through trying to figure out what comparisons you want to make. And you know, I'll say it's created by a guy named John Schwabish, who's a leader in the data visualization field, translating it for policy. He put this together maybe over a decade ago, but it still is a great point of inspiration when you're just getting started trying to think of what do I want to show, what do I want to explain or get across. So when thinking about advocacy and impact, most audiences will want to engage, this is important, will want to engage with something they are familiar with. I know that there's a lot of really beautiful, inventive, innovative projects related to data visualization, interactive dashboards, so on and so forth that are out there. And honestly, it's a mind-boggling world to go exploring, and I strongly encourage everybody to do so. But if we're talking about advocacy and impact, it's a really good idea to just keep it simple. People like what they're familiar with, what they've seen before. And so, yeah, stick with a line chart, a bar chart, a donut chart, or a map. Timelines and flow charts can also be useful, but the key thing when choosing the chart, complicated isn't always better. Keep it simple on this one. You can make it really pretty going forward, and we'll talk about how to do that, but start simple. You'll have a lot of time. If you get good at it, you'll have a lot of time to get more and more advanced and make one of those beautiful, interactive, like the COVID-19 dashboard that everybody's been using. But yeah, start simple with those basic line, bar, donut, and maps. So line charts are useful for showing or tracking change over time. And this line chart is from a PPG report on public transportation and employment centers. This was put together in 2017 with the intention of telling a well-known story in a visually interesting way. So most people, especially on this call, will know that Western New York faces and has faced population decline over the past 5 or 6 decades, maybe longer. The data visualization will tell you exactly. But like this is very similar to most of the Great Lakes cities. And at the top of the chart, we added general time periods categorized by major social and political forces that were taking place. And sort of you can see what happens to the population as those forces are unfolding or at their peak. You can see the process of suburbanization occur at the expense of the city, followed by a period where population is lost across the board due to monetary and trade reforms that accelerated globalization and American deindustrialization. This is one of the fundamental questions that people in Buffalo ask, is how did we lose so much population? What happened? And whether people are highly educated or have never attended a day of school in their life, it's a question that comes up, and it's one that there is no there's no one single answer to. A lot of things happened over time. And this line chart tries to show that in a relatively direct way. Moving on to bar charts. Bar charts are effective at comparing values across categories. And so here's another chart from the Working Toward Equality report. The first bar chart up there shows the proportion of Black workers as a proportion of the Erie County workforce in key industries. And just keep in mind that this data is from 2015. The second bar chart is a stacked bar chart that shows the relative earnings of Black workers to white workers in the same industry. This isn't nationally, this is locally, this is our backyard, this is Erie County, New York. And as an example, Black workers account for 18% of the administrative and support and waste management workforce in Erie County, but they are only making 57 cents on the dollar when compared to white workers in the same industry. Data visualization, we talk about wage gaps, gender wage gaps, racial wage gaps, but I think it really doesn't hit home until you see it in black and white, or in green and blue in this case. This third bar chart that I wanted to share with you is from a report advocating for regular commuter rail services between Buffalo and Toronto. The segment between Buffalo and Niagara Falls would need to be redeveloped, and this chart is making a visual argument that commuter rail is one of the most cost-effective approaches to redevelop that branch. And we'll talk a little bit more about using color, like I did here, using color for emphasis a little bit later. Now, a lot of people really love talking about pie charts. A lot of people really love pie charts. And there's a lot of people, professionals who are in this space who will say, don't do it. Don't ever make a pie chart. I have a slightly different opinion. Go back to that, keep it simple. People like what they're familiar with. And my opinion is that people are comfortable with pie charts. Well, yeah, we are Americans and we like pie. That's as simple as that, I think. But seriously, I recommend limiting the number of categories. If you are going to use a circular representation of data like this, limit the number of categories to 2 or 3. Anything more than that can and probably will be confusing and difficult to interpret. But I won't ever tell you don't make a pie chart. Just be very careful when you do. So here's another example from the 2017 PPG Working Toward Equality report. The donut chart that we used is used to both display data on labor force participation, but more importantly, I would say it's used to educate the reader on how unemployment rates are actually calculated. A lot of people don't really understand where that unemployment rate comes from, and how numbers translate from what, let's say, what they see on the news and then what they read in the paper, and the numbers just don't make sense to them. So I use this visualization actually from the PPG report to help explain and visualize what unemployment actually is. And it's an effective visualization. I've used it over and over again. But this donut chart breaks up the idea of employment or labor force participation into the 3 primary categories. those working, those unemployed, and those that do not work for whatever reason that might be. Older adults, students, people who are disabled. There's a lot of reasons why people don't work or are unable to seek work. But we took that one chart and we created multiple other charts to compare it to compare differences across race and ethnicity. We then used the labels to provide summary statements on each category. And one of the things that always stuck out to me about this one is that our society focuses on unemployment rates and the gaps between those rates. But I want you to pay attention to the gaps between actual employment rates. I don't think we hear certain people talking about populations that aren't working and they should work. We hear about people who are unemployed, they should go find work, but we don't. I don't think we really see employment rates sort of presented so straightforwardly. And I think the gap between employment across demographic groups is another stark message that people might want to hear a little bit more of. I'll get my thoughts out of there. Excuse me. So one other chart you can use, you can choose to use is a map. And these are a little bit tougher to create because making your own custom maps might require some geographic knowledge and specialized skills. But if you build the skill set, you can visualize nearly any type of information. And this map is one that I created for the Buffalo and Erie County Lead Safe Task Force to make it a little bit easier for people on that task force to think about the prevalence of childhood lead poisoning in the city of Buffalo. And this is what I think a good example of where local knowledge really comes in, because New York State and other policymakers, media, so on and so forth, they'd all discuss and understand the issue of childhood lead poisoning as one that occurs in some zip codes, but not in others. And they talk about it using zip codes as the frame of geographic reference. And others, like researchers like myself, other people, we say, okay, zip code's a little bit too big. We want to look at block groups. I think that's one of the smallest scales that we can look at to see where are these clusters forming. Zip code's too big. Block group is more precise. But in Buffalo, as many of you might know, the way that we talk about local geography is through the lens of neighborhoods. We don't talk about block groups and we don't necessarily talk about zip codes. And so as an example, in Buffalo, local actors, local people are just better able to understand the issue and take action on it if they know that there's a cluster in Broadway Fillmore. And you can see that cluster in the middle of the map. Alternatively, the way policymakers talk about that particular cluster is that it's split between 14211 and 14212, which if you're from Buffalo, that doesn't really tell you anything about where that cluster is, other than a broad general geographic region. So one of the key things that I'm doing here is taking all of those different views or all of those different perspectives. So the policymakers are looking at zip codes. We do display the zip codes here. The block groups, we definitely, we want to know exactly where we should be targeting our resources to address childhood lead poisoning. But in terms of everybody having an ability to actually be conversant on this issue, we add the lens of neighborhoods. We overlay neighborhoods on top so people can actually have a local conversation about what's going on in their community. Perfect. Now, I'm going to move on to ideas of showing impact. So you've seen some of these techniques already. We've taken a look at a few examples of basic charts. And to show impact on these charts, you'll need to include the change, which is usually the chart itself, and some sort of change agent, which is usually like a policy or an intervention, an event, a program, whatever that change agent might be. And I define impact here as a measurable change in something that occurs as an effect or reaction to some sort of intervention. And so here we're looking at employment rates before, during, and after the Great Recession. This is again from the Working Toward Equality report, but this one has been updated by somebody else. You saw this earlier today due to COVID. And yeah, I'll just say the way that we did it in Working Toward Equality is similar to the way that the folks from Equitable Growth did it when they were tracking disparities in unemployment rates. To show impact, This is the golden rule for showing impact. The easiest thing you can do is add a dotted line or a shaded area to your line graph or to your bar graph to show what's before, what's after, to show those comparisons. And these charts both show the effect of the Great Recession on unemployment rates using this technique. You can see the dotted line, and you can see the shaded area there. Now, this next visualization uses that dotted line technique to tell a much more complicated story. They bring in color in a great way, I think. This time about refugee populations in America. And population growth is something that I know that most politicians, business leaders, and investors care about. So this is a message that resonates with a lot of people, not just those who are using data visualizations for advocacy and impact. But this visualization from CityLab shows that refugee admissions kept population growth positive for cities across the country in the first 2 decades of the 2000s. And this, you can see here, it doesn't include Buffalo, but it does include Utica and Syracuse, 2 cities that are relatively close to Cornell and Ithaca. And if you're a policymaker in one of these communities and you're going to make a decision or you're going to voice support or against, let's say, national legislation, state policy related to refugees, if I'm an elected official, a business leader, or anybody from Utica or Syracuse, it's going to change my mind about how I feel about refugees, especially if I'm banking on my business doing well due to population growth. So from across the board, I'll say that I just really love this visualization because it really does tell a story. It's easy to, it hammers the point home for anybody who's reading that many cities in America would be losing population, declining in population, if not for refugees that have been admitted and resettled in the States. Sorry about that. Excuse me. So taking it up another notch, this idea of dotted lines and shading, is this data visualization. I didn't create this one. I wish I did. I love it. But it's from the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it focuses on social distancing during the Spanish flu epidemic. And it uses the impact method of shading to show how social distancing worked on a set of what we call small multiples. So this is, small multiples are just what they see. You see many versions of the same chart in different contexts. And so this is a small multiples data visualization that uses shading to make quick comparisons so that we can learn what works. And this visualization shows that during the Spanish flu epidemic, cities that ordered social distancing measures later and for shorter periods had bigger spikes in deaths and higher overall death rates. And on the other hand, cities that ordered social distancing measures earlier and for longer periods usually slowed their infections. If you look down in the lower, I think it's the left or the right-hand corner, you can see the sort of title image of this presentation. Do you see any familiarities between the small multiples and our sort of global flatten the curve graph? This is essentially showing, I think, the closest way I can show of how we're learning what works from our past experience and then applying that in the current period using a data visualization to incentivize or push behavior change. One other way that you can make comparisons is by using a policy map. And this example is from a report I created for the NFTA Citizen Advisory Committee to review rider ideas to make public transit more family friendly. And we used a simple map of the United States, very simple, easy to add location markers and captions to summarize best practices we found from across the country. And I can say from personal experience that this is a very effective way to get regular everyday people to listen to your wonky policy ideas. I spent a lot of time looking at what works in other places and even more time trying to convince people here in Buffalo or in Las Vegas or other places I work that those policies are a good idea. And this is, I'll just say over and over and over again, if you make a policy map, you throw some best practices on there, people will give you a little bit more time because we like pictures. That's just how it goes. And policy can be dry sometimes. Okay, so this visualization is a series of donut charts created for the United Way of Southern Nevada that shows the relative cost of childcare for different families. And the key here is that the chart is simple and consistent and is really showing one primary category, which is the proportion of income spent on childcare. And as a good tip for advocacy, I picked this one because it's always a good idea to think about how you can humanize a visualization. At its core, policy is about people, and it is very much easier to share complex policy ideas if the visualization is humanized in some way. So if you're trying to communicate complex policy, try and visualize a human moving through that policy, or the role that a human, the things that a human experiences. Because the next time you share that data visualization with somebody, you probably have a name that you can put to that person. You probably have a general story, a profile that you can use to help tell the story of that policy and why it might be so important for that particular unnamed individual. And so here's another visualization focused on communicating policy. And in this case, it's the earned income tax credit, a really complicated one that many Americans don't really know what it is or what it does, but the EITC is in fact the most effective poverty reduction intervention in the history of the United States. Yet most people don't know about it. And so this visualization tries to communicate the significance of this policy excuse me, by using two different concepts, the concepts of scaffolding and content. Now, the scaffolding is used to tell the story of the policy. It shows the humanized aspect, the impact line, the descriptive captions. It's telling you what is going on with that policy, what's going on to that person. But at the same time, the content is simultaneously visualizing what is happening to that individual or that family's income through successive years of EITC. And you can tell it's a simple bar graph, a very simple bar graph. And as earned income increases above the poverty line, the tax credit is phased out over time. New York State's pretty generous when it comes to, compared to the rest of the states, New York State is generous when it comes to the EITC. We have a state match for it, but very few states actually offer anything substantive in terms of on top of what the federal EITC is, but it is quite effective at reducing poverty rates. So taking the next step with this EITC graphic, here's a very brief checklist of features to keep in mind as you do develop your own data visualizations for policy advocacy. You'll want a bold title, a descriptive subtitle, story captions, an impact line, strong and simple content, and humanized. You want to make sure you have those humanized elements. So I see that there is a question that just came in. When should you use a stacked bar chart versus an unstacked bar chart? So the chart choice is always going to be based on the type of data you're trying to visualize and the type of message that you're trying to get across. I can say that in this particular case, I used a stacked bar chart because I wanted to show where, let's say, a hypothetical individual's income would be without the EITC. And I chose that stacked bar chart to show how EITC actually lifts a family's income or an individual's income above the poverty line. And it keeps them technically above the poverty line until they're able to earn enough income to not need the EITC anymore, which is effectively that they are no longer living with an income that's below the poverty line. Potentially this could be used to help low-income families, which is 200% of the poverty line, to follow the same trajectory. But in terms of like when you should use a stacked bar chart and when you should use a regular bar, like a regular unstacked bar chart, that's going to be a case-by-case decision. Okay, I see another question about software recommendations, but I will get to that at the end. But I will. Yeah, let's keep moving then. So this is the full image of the EITC, graphic. And pretty quickly, I'd like to walk us through one of the best resources that I've ever used. This is the last main one that I'll share before sharing some software recommendations. But this data visualization checklist is gold. It is true gold if you are making data visualizations, and hopefully you'll see why. But this comes from Stephanie Evergreen and Anne Emery. These are two national leaders when it comes to data visualization for monitoring and evaluation. So more so on the impact and measuring and monitoring impact as opposed to communicating advocacy. But the data viz checklist can work across the board. It's a step-by-step guide for taking raw Excel chart data, raw Excel charts, and making them more effective at communicating your primary message. And the checklist includes guidance on 24 different points across 5 categories: text, arrangement, color, lines, and overall structure. So let's take a quick walk through the checklist and I'll show you how it works. Now, the first category of tips are about text in the chart. Graphs don't contain much text, so the existing text must encapsulate your message and pack a punch. Imagine, and I've seen this happen all the time, people take the visualization out of the report, or they take the visualization out of something else and they dump it into, they sort of plug it into another article, losing all of the descriptive and narrative context. You want to be able to, and it's easy to have your message misused in that way then as well. So you want to make sure that the data visualizations you're putting together do have the content and the scaffolding and descriptive text in a way that makes it possible for that data viz to stand alone without the 25-page report that goes along with it. And so, yes, a 6 to 12 word descriptive title is a good habit to get into. Make sure it's left justified, and in the upper left corner, your subtitle and annotation should provide additional information, and the text size should be hierarchical and readable. And text should always be horizontal because that's how we read. That's how most users read. Sorry, to go back to this, and you can see how Stephanie Evergreen in this example created a new title and sort of subtitle to help explain what's going on in this chart. Now, the other 2 points related to text are that data have to be labeled directly, or should be labeled directly, and you should be really sparing when you're using your labels and applying those labels. You can see the image, the first image has like a ton of numbers on it, and no general reader is really going to be able to understand or may not spend the time figuring out what all those numbers mean. And so this is just the second example, is a great example of using labels in a direct way and really letting the message speak for what the data are showing us. The next category is arrangement. Improper arrangements of graph elements can confuse readers at best and mislead viewers at worst. That's definitely true. So thoughtful arrangement makes a data visualization easier to interpret. You have to have accurate proportions. Data should be intentionally ordered. Your axes need to be set up correctly. The graph should be 2-dimensional, no 3D graphs, please. And the display should be free from decoration. And in these 2 examples, I'm showing you what not to do. Both of these have problematic y-axes that have been changed in ways that sort of grossly misrepresent the data being visualized. The Obamacare visualization seems to start the axis at about 5.5 million, which makes it look like there's a bigger gap than there actually is between those 2 data points. And the gun deaths graph, if you haven't noticed it yet, has a y-axis that is upside down, which obviously misleads the viewer about the impact of this particular piece of policy. They're using a data visualization to try and show, well, at least I interpret it at first, that the stand your ground law led to a decrease in gun deaths, when in fact, the stand your ground law led to a spike in gun deaths in Florida. So you always want to make sure that you're being honest with your arrangement so that your viewers or your readers, your audience, can quickly comprehend what it is you're trying to get across. Excuse me. Now, when it comes to our next category, color, remember to keep culture-laden color connotations in mind. I know it might be tempting to use pink and blue for gender, or to use skin tones for race and ethnicity.
I'm just waiting for her to hit me. Okay.
And yeah, we also use red, yellow, green a lot. So just be careful who you're labeling as red, which has a negative connotation, and who you're labeling as green, which has a positive connotation. You just have to be very, very aware of your colors and make sure that your color scheme is intentional. Color is used to highlight key patterns, and it needs to be legible when printed in black and white, and it needs to be legible for people with color blindness. A good way to do that is to make sure the text sufficiently contrasts with the background. And you can see in this example here, Again, from Evergreen Data, Stephanie Evergreen did this one. She transformed the, excuse me, the color choice so that she could, number one, improve readability for colorblind people. Number two, changing the color made the viz printable in black and white. And number three, she used color to directly emphasize the Midwest categories. So the title as well, the text, going back to text, reinforces the main message that this bar chart is communicating. Oh, and if you have trouble or don't know where to start in terms of finding the right colors, or you need color tools to help you, Color Brewer is an excellent tool that you can use online to find color schemes suitable for reprinting in black and white and for color blindness. And then Instant Eyedropper is like the eyedropper tool that you might have in Photoshop or Paint. It makes it possible to instantly match colors. So if you want a data visualization that matches your logo or your brand mark or the colors of your organizations or the color of an event, you can use Instant Eyedropper to get an exact match on those colors. Now, the next category of checklist tips is all about lines. Excessive lines like grid lines, borders, tick marks, and axes can add clutter or noise to a graph. So eliminate them whenever they're not useful. And the key lines to remember to remove are the tick marks, grid lines, and border lines. You can get a good sense of how removing the lines can be helpful for focusing the audience's attention by looking at this again from this set of charts, again from the data viz checklist. You'll see this one right in the checklist itself. But and it has this anatomy chart. So if you don't know what a grid line is, or you don't know what a tick mark is, or you don't know what a subtitle or subtitle, what I mean when I'm referring to those words, this anatomy chart will also help you identify those different chart elements. Now, the final category is about overall chart structure and presentation. Graphs will catch a viewer's attention, so only visualize the data that needs that attention. You want to make sure that your graph is highlighting significant findings, that the graph is appropriate for the data that you're showing, excuse me, and that individual chart elements work together to reinforce the overarching takeaway message. I'm sorry if you hear a siren. I do live near a firehouse in the city, and sometimes they go off. In this example, you can see Stephanie Evergreen has transformed this pie chart into a much more easy, a bar graph that is much easier to understand. Okay, so taking the data viz checklist and applying it to one of the vizes that I created in the past, one that you've seen today, I've run that Clean Air Coalition viz through this process. You can see that the original version is up there that Excel would spit out. We revise the text, we remove the marks to improve the arrangement, we edit our use of lines by getting rid of those tick marks and the borders, and we make a final round of edits to improve the overall structure. And so start to finish, this is what that original 2009 graphic looks like. The one on the left is the one that was in the policy memo from Clean Air Coalition to the DEC back in early 2009. And this revised version is the one that we used at the beginning of the presentation. So hopefully you can see the before and after pretty obviously there. And you can use this approach to create clean data visualizations for social media, printed reports, promotional materials, advocacy efforts, and as I mentioned before, to translate complicated policy concepts for all audiences. So I know that we are just past 1:30, and I know some people may have already left or had to leave. So I just want to take a moment to take some questions, and then I can go over some of the resources that I was hoping to share today. Do we still have enough time, Kristen? Great. Okay, software recommendations, and we have some great, yes, thank you, Monica. Dr. Stevens from UB's Geography Department. She makes incredible maps and knows a lot about great graphic design, and she shared the link to Color Brewer. So strongly recommend that if you're not a graphic designer and you don't know much about why you would choose certain colors over others. So Lauren asks, do you have a general approach to working with partners and community to develop these visualizations? Yes, I have my own process, but every case, of course, is different. Every issue is different, and every set of stakeholders is gonna be will find themselves unable to communicate with each other for different reasons. So always go back that it's case by case. But my general approach is to always start with a sketch. I don't look at the data. I don't create any data visualizations until we've had an opportunity to go through about 5 or 6 napkin sketches. That today's session was supposed to be a lunchtime session. I was assuming that there might be napkins next to everybody where we could practice sketching out charts. But I do have a worksheet. Actually, this is a good time to mention it. If you would like to, sketching, I'll just say sketching is my approach. Always sketch before you create, and then continuously try to revise it for understanding. But at the bottom of this slide is a link to acroadvice.com/dataviz. And I've put, the recording will be up there. I've put some of the visualizations from today's session up there. And there's also a sketching worksheet that you can use. That if this were a 2-hour session over lunch, we would have gone through that sketching worksheet and really had a chance to walk through that process. But that sketch worksheet at acroadvice.com/dataviz should help you get started in terms of the sketching process. Hopefully that answered your question, Lauren. Okay, and here is a question from Alan. I'm involved in community planning, and the visuals I need most are site plans and simple 3D renderings. Are there any tools that help produce those without requiring design skills? Site plans and simple 3D renderings. I'm not sure. I'm not a CAD designer, so I don't know exactly, blueprints, other things like that. I can't give you great advice on that, but I will hopefully, I will share some resources and software that maybe it's a lot simpler than you think. I'm not a graphic designer by training. A lot of this is self-taught, and I honestly use Excel and Word, Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word to put together and assemble a lot of my data visualizations. And I think pretty much anybody can use Excel and Word. You don't necessarily need design skills. But we can talk about that. If Alan, please feel free to send an email if you'd like a little bit more information on that. Okay, Jim Jones is asking, where do you find most of your data aggregation and where do you do most of your data aggregation and manipulation? Jim, is this a question about software? I'm going to assume that it is. Excel or GIS. Yeah, so this is going back to the map making. If you have those specialized GIS skills, which some people go to college for a very, very long time to build, as you know, I do. So yes, I will typically do my basic data visualizations in Excel and Word, but I use QGIS and sometimes ArcGIS to create my maps. And then I move back and forth through these different pieces of software. But data aggregation and manipulation, sometimes I use database management software like Microsoft Access. Sometimes you can do it in Excel. Sometimes I use something a little bit more advanced called Jupyter Lab, and that's it's kind of getting into Python at that point to manipulate some of the data. But from simple to advanced, there's a spot for everybody depending on where your skill level is. There's software for everybody. And I see, yep. Dr. Stevens said I use R for most maps and graphs now. And how do I feel? Oh, Aaron is asking me, how do I feel about Illustrator? I have never used it, but I know people are on, I don't know Photoshop. I use an open source alternative called GIMP. And yeah, I'm kind of an open source software kind of person, so I don't use the Adobe suite, but there are people I know on this call that do. And I've seen some really beautiful things created using that piece of software. Oh, and then there's one other question that I'll address before I move on. Do you have experience with social network analysis? And if so, is there a software you would recommend? I will say that I have never done my own software, social network analysis in the, I would say, traditional or pure academic sense. But I have seen it done many, many times. And I know that there are quite a few different pieces of software
Hey, Aaron,
So
I can answer that if you'd like.
thank you, Monica. Thank you.
So I do quite a bit of sorry, I've got a toddler yelling outside my door at the moment. I do quite a bit of social network analysis, and for the most part, I use R, and R has a couple packets that help with both the analysis side as well as the visualization of social networks. I used to use more proprietary software like UCINet, but actually as your data sets get bigger, it's really easy to exceed those. And the advantage of R is that you can replicate the same analysis over and over again with different data sets, going down to like exporting the same visualizations that sort of match and mimic each other and make one small change and reproduce all the same visualizations over and over again. And then you can't really do that with UCINet, and that you can then similarly use the same social network analysis data for both your social network as well as your maps.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. Monica, can you add your email address in the comments in case there's anybody who might want to connect with you on some of the more advanced visualization techniques? Great. Okay, now with that, I'm going to share just a few resources. I know we are getting closer and closer to 2 o'clock, and there's a few other questions coming in. So just give me 5 more minutes to share some of these resources. So getting into some of those pieces of software that we were just talking about, this slide really summarizes it. If you want to make charts, like the things that you've seen in the presentation, you can make them using these programs, right? So if you want to make line charts like that unemployment line chart, you can make that in Excel, in Word, in Google Sheets. You can use the open source alternative, LibreOffice. They have Calc and OpenOffice as well. So there's always open source alternatives if you don't have the budget for a Microsoft Suite or something like that. If you want to make maps, I strongly encourage the use of QGIS. That's my main GIS software, but there are also really powerful systems in the form of ArcGIS and Carto. ArcGIS and Carto both have really great online support at this stage. So if you're trying to make web maps from the get-go, I would say start with ArcGIS or Carto rather than QGIS. If you'd like to make dashboards like the one, like the COVID-19 dashboard that you may have seen from Johns Hopkins University, or a dashboard like you've seen from elsewhere, number one, remember that dashboards are a combination of multiple simple charts. So if you can master creating individual charts like we were talking about today, then you can start putting those together and making them interactive in really interesting ways. And Tableau is definitely the leader when it comes to the leading software when it comes to creating dashboards, but it is also very expensive for most people and many organizations. Esri's ArcGIS Online, you can create web apps, interactive web apps for a lower cost, and then Power BI from Microsoft. I'm not entirely sure of the cost there, but I do believe it's less expensive than Tableau. But Tableau is becoming the industry standard, so if you're thinking about a software purchase for the next 5 to 10 years, I have a feeling that Tableau is going to be with us for a long time. And then finally, the advanced visualizations, like that small multiples that I shared of the Spanish flu epidemic. Monica Stevens from UB already shared that she uses RStudio. I tend to use Jupyter. They do different things. And then there's, if you know JavaScript, you can use something called D3 to make some really incredible visualizations. But all of those at the bottom, I use the word advanced because the skill sets that you need to develop, to use those systems are very advanced. Yeah, any questions on the software options? Quick question.
Hey, Aaron, you've had a couple of questions about Illustrator, and I can help you out with that. And that it is easy to use. It's easy to work with the, sort of integrate with your data, but it doesn't export automatically you get it exported into Illustrator, but you have to manipulate it, and then you have to manipulate each individual image. You can't script the manipulation. It's very expensive because you have to actually have Adobe Creative Cloud, and you have to pay a monthly fee with that. And it's very expensive for what you can do with it, even though it does do really amazing things if you're a professional, if you've learned the very basics of it. I still use it because I learned it a long time ago, but I think even UB has moved away from it, and I think most educational institutions no longer have licenses for it.
Thanks, Monica.
And there were two questions in the chat that may have disappeared already. So one is, how do you suggest to represent future data that might not be available, especially relating to climate change? For example, available farmland in 2050. So I'll start with that one.
Yeah, that's a tough question, especially if you are not, let's say, a land use modeler at a university. Showing future data that doesn't exist yet, we call those projections, and they usually have to be based on some sort of evidence-based model. So if we're talking about climate change or change in farmland, we typically look at, or even let's say flood risk is something that I'm working on right now as well. We look at past data to inform what we think is going to happen. And I guess my advice would be to do as much research as you possibly can and find out what 3 to 5 to 10 different scientists and different models are saying will happen to farmland. And then if you have the skill, apply that model to the variables going on, let's say here in Western New York or wherever you're going. But showing projected data is, as you saw during COVID-19, is subject to a lot of debate, as we've probably all seen growing up in the debates around climate change. We know things are happening, but we tend to debate the projections, whether they're valid or not, and not the fact that they're all sort of pointing in the same direction. So hopefully that's some helpful points, but I will say that be careful with data that doesn't exist, because there are always people smarter than you that will undercut what you've created, and try to, especially if you're doing advocacy work.
And then another question, how would you advise organizations on building internal capacity to do this versus hiring outside help? What funding streams seem to be most supportive of funding organizations who do not currently have the capacity for this, like smaller or newer nonprofits?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that after COVID and the George Floyd protests and everything else that's happening, it is going to be a lot easier to convince funders that this is a necessary skill and that this is a necessary capacity that your organization needs. So first and foremost, just know that the importance and demand for data visualization is about to skyrocket, and you do want to be positioned for that. In terms of building that capacity, I think that, when we think of capacity, there are a lot of different levels of capacity. I was originally hired as internal capacity for an organization here in Western New York, and I quickly learned that, let's say, what they needed me to do wasn't, I could take that small bit of what they actually needed me to do professionally and sort of expand it across many, many different organizations, which is why I left to start my own business. But in terms of smaller nonprofits, I would say, this is where the budget's not there and you don't necessarily know if you need to hire a data visualization specialist. I'll say that, M&T Bank has a small army of people that do this and only this. But there's money to support all of them, right? A full-time staff person is very expensive, especially for smaller nonprofits. So I would say try to build the skill inside your organization, inside existing staff that are interested, tech savvy, data literate, because once you make a few of these types of visualizations, you can get really good at it. You know what you have to do, you know where to find what buttons to press, so on and so forth. And yeah, I would say data viz checklist. Every time you're trying to create a data visualization, you go through that checklist, and you share it with your colleagues, you will increase your organization's capacity for data visualization significantly. I can't underestimate how important that data viz checklist is at creating effective images. Does that help, Kristen? Okay. Great. There's a few other questions, but I think I'll take those offline because they were sent to me individually. So in addition to the software options, if you remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I brought up one of my personal heroes, Nicholas Copernicus. His name's actually Mikolai Kopernik. And this group out of Indonesia created something called the Copernik Impact Tech Tracker. And this is one of my absolute favorite tools to encourage people interested in learning about this to go explore. And maybe, Brittany, maybe this helps answer your question as well. Copernik is really great because it allows you to easily compare and search and compare a bunch of different software options related to mobile data collection, GIS systems, remote sensing, and data analysis and visualization. And it walks you through a couple different screens, but you can see on this, for this category of online mapping, they are comparing 5 different systems, including Cardo and ArcGIS Online that I just referenced. They compare them on usability, affordability, and accessibility. And I just think the Copernik Impact Tech Tracker is one of the most useful tools if you're trying to figure out what software to use to do this based on your budget. So as I mentioned, there are some open source and free options in there as well. But yeah, the Copernik Impact Tech Tracker, really, really useful. In terms of data sources, I have listed a variety of publicly available data sources. The world of data is growing every day, and it's not just private corporations that can do great things with data. It is all of us, civil society, local governments, so on and so forth. They're all making their data available. So all the way from the US Census Bureau and their American Fact Finder through the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, county health rankings from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and then Open Data New York. These are great outside resources. And honestly, I didn't put the visualization in here, but the Sunlight Foundation and the Open Knowledge Foundation did a census in 2019 of the country's best or top municipal open data systems. And Open Data Buffalo was tied at number 4 with San Francisco. It is one of the best. I'll say we have one of the best and most user-friendly open data systems in the country, and that's something we shouldn't take lightly. We're really lucky as a region to have Open Data Buffalo and the team behind it. They're really doing good work to make sure that information is open and accessible to us. So those are some great data resources. And then I just wanted to share and give a shout out to these four people. They're kind of like me. They're individuals that run their own consulting organizations, consulting businesses, I'll say. Evergreen Data from Stephanie Evergreen. You saw a lot from her today. And I just want to say she has a great blog, great how-to resources. I would consider a lot of my practice very much informed by Stephanie Evergreen's leadership in this space. Follow her on Twitter, whatever you want. She's highly recommended. PolicyViz is run by the same guy who created the graphic Continuum, John Schwabish. And he has an incredible data visualization catalog. So he not only has the graphic Continuum, but he also has assembled a great catalog of data visualizations that you can download as examples and for inspiration. The other piece that I wanted to share was from a guy named Alberto Cairo. He wrote a book called The Functional Art. He has a blog called The Functional Art. And I took the idea of content and scaffolding from Alberto Cairo. And Alberto Cairo is like the godfather of data visualization. I forget which university he is at, but he's written multiple books. And if I am informed by Stephanie Evergreen's practice, everybody here is informed by Alberto Cairo's practice. So The Functional Art is a great resource. And then the last one that has influenced me for over a decade, probably nearly all those 15 years of work in this area, is Flowing Data. And Flowing Data is run by a guy named Dr. Nathan Yao, who has a PhD in statistics, but he has a regular blog. If you want to learn of beautiful data visualizations, a lot of how-tos, if you want to learn how to use R, if you want to learn how to create really interactive, visual, moving data visualizations using R, Flowing Data is going to be a great resource for you. And one thing that and most people don't know is that Flowing Data as a blog started here in Buffalo. Nathan Yao moved to Buffalo with his wife, who got a job, and he was intrigued by our local visualizations while he was living here, and he started this blog. And so if you subscribe to Flowing Data, you'll not only get industry-leading insights in terms of what you should do and how you should do visualization, but you might also catch a random Buffalo Easter egg in his visualizations more often than not. It's really nice to have that pop up in your inbox. So yeah, those are, as I say, cool stuff, awesome people. If you really want to get into this, these 4 are great starting points. And so with that, I will say thank you so much. I see we're coming up on 2. I just want to say thank you so much to Kristen and the team at Buffalo Commons and PPG and the Buffalo CoLab. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, we've got a few more minutes if there are questions or closeout thoughts.
I will say that any of the resources and links that we shared in the chat will be emailed. We will also email the recording along with the survey, and we'll link to some of the things that Aaron had mentioned that may not have been shared in the chat as well. There was one question, and I know people are jumping off. There was one question about free courses, and I don't know if any of the things you had just mentioned in the last 2 slides were free, or how you or others could break into this type of industry or build their own capacity.
Sure. Okay, so these last 2 slides, well, I'll go to the software. Some of the software is free, some is not. If you're on a tight budget, I would encourage you to look at the open source options in there. OpenOffice, LibreOffice, QGIS, and then RStudio and Jupyter, I know for a fact those are free as well. Those are, if you have the skill, you can use them. These data sources, these are all free, open, and publicly accessible and regularly updated. And then cool stuff, awesome people. They're across the board. There's free information and free resources, free visuals, free techniques. But then there's there are business people as well. There's a paywall if you want a training, if you want to attend a workshop, if you'd like access to some of the specialized tutorials. It's not all free, but there's free stuff everywhere when it comes to data visualization.
Great. And one more question. Are there any open data sets for non-governmental research sets or information?
Yes, but I will say that most of the data you're going to find, if it's free and open to the public, it will be assembled by a government somewhere and therefore released by a government. You can find information about private sector companies. I think Reference USA is one that I would recommend in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. If you have a library card, you can access Reference USA for free. That is a great resource if you want to know stuff about specific businesses or industries. And then I will also say that there is a multi-billion-dollar industry around proprietary data. And a lot of it is just behind a paywall. And it's not just here's $20 kind of paywall. It's more like here's $20,000 kind of paywall. So you really, like there's a divide between what private corporations are able to access and what we are able to access from public sources. But if you have the budget, you can access any kind of information, it seems like these days. Hopefully that was helpful and not too cynical.
True, it's very
Great. Do you see any other questions, Kristen?
I don't think so. I think that may be it. If you do have any questions, again, in the follow-up email, we'll put Aaron's information. We'll put all the information that we have in there. So thanks all.
Yeah. And just one more reminder, acroadvice.com/dataviz, you can access what I call the Sketchwork Show and Tell worksheet. that'll help you, think about chart choice, what you want your main messages to be, and gives you space to sketch out what you think that visualization might look like. And as you can see the title, don't even think of touching a spreadsheet yet. So whenever you're going to visualize, go to a whiteboard, go to a napkin, but don't go to your computer. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Erin.
There we go. Thanks, Monica, and thank you so much for jumping in and sharing a little bit about R and your other. I know you do a lot more advanced work